According to the question, currently the economy is at the real GDP of Y1, which is less than the potential output YN. Here, to be consistent with what we've been using in the lectures, I'll denote the potential output as YP. First, let's use the Keynesian cross to depict the current equilibrium. We'll start with the axes with planned aggregate expenditures on the y-axis, output y on the x-axis. We have the 45-degree line, which depicts all the possible points of equilibrium where y equals planned aggregate expenditures. And we have our economy depicted by our planned aggregate expenditures function, which starts at a positive number because we'll probably have autonomous consumption and planned investment. And we have a positive slope for the planned aggregate expenditures because of MPC. Where these two graphs meet is your current equilibrium, which is at Y1, and we know that our potential output is probably somewhere on the right-hand side of our current equilibrium. So here's our current state of the economy on the Keynesian cross. Now we'll also use the ADS model to depict the current equilibrium. Again, we'll start with the axes with aggregate price on the y-axis, aggregate output on the x-axis. That's your output, or y. We know that our long-run aggregate supply curve will be vertical at the potential output yp, which means if our current equilibrium output is at a lower level than the potential output, then we're probably at a short-run equilibrium, which also means that our aggregate demand, the downward sloping aggregate demand, and the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply will be crossing at a point that is on the left-hand side of the long-run aggregate supply curve. And so we have our short-run equilibrium where our output at the time is lower than the potential output at Y1. Our equilibrium aggregate price is at P1. Now the central bank is going to reduce the discount rate, which is an example of an expansionary monetary policy. If we depict the change on the liquidity preference model, well, we'll have to start by drawing out the liquidity preference model first. We have our quantity of money on the x-axis, the nominal interest rate on the y-axis. We know that the money supply will be vertical at the level the Fed chooses, let's say M1 bar, and our money demand is downward sloping. Where these 2 points meet is our equilibrium. Our equilibrium quantity of money is obviously going to be M1 bar. Our equilibrium nominal interest rate is going to be at I1. This is our short-run equilibrium. Now, once the central bank reduces the discount rate, what this means is that even if banks fall under the reserve requirements by lending more aggressively, they can still borrow from the Fed at the discount window by paying the discount rate, which is going to be lower than before. So the penalty for banks, even when they fall under the reserve requirements, is actually going to be less. This is going to give more incentive for banks to create more loans more aggressively, which increases the money supply in this economy. So we're going to see a rightward shift of the money supply curve to the blue line at money supply prime because we'll be seeing a higher amount of quantity of money at M2 bar. And as a result, we're going to see the nominal interest rate falling to I2. If the nominal interest rate is lower, then that means the cost of borrowing for firms is going to be also lower, which promotes firms to invest more. We're going to see more planned investment happening in this economy. As a result, your planned aggregate expenditures, which is the sum of your consumption, planned investment spending, government spending, and net exports, is going to rise because your planned investment spending is rising. This will show up on the Keynesian cross as an upward shift of the planned aggregate expenditures by the increased amount in your planned investment. We're going to see our equilibrium shifting to the point where the new planned aggregate expenditure curve, the green curve, meets the 45-degree line, and we'll see a rise in the equilibrium output as well. Here, I'm just explicitly drawing out the case where we see a result of the expansionary monetary policy, but it's not enough to completely close the output gap. So we see a rise in output from Y1 to Y2, but not quite up to the potential output of YP. On the ADS model, that means we'll be somewhere between Y1 and YP in terms of our new equilibrium output. And because we have an increase in our planned aggregate expenditures, which leads to an increase in output, while aggregate prices haven't changed, that's going to show up as a rightward shift of your aggregate demand. In other words, we see a higher demand coming from primarily firms through planned investment. We see that our equilibrium output is indeed higher than before, but we're still on a short-run equilibrium because we're not completely at the potential output just yet. But as a result of the increase in aggregate demand, we're also going to see our aggregate price rising relatively as well. Well, what if we were able to reduce the discount rate by the right amount so that we were able to get rid of the output gap entirely? Because as we can see from the ADS model, our output is lower than the potential output, which implies that we are in a recession. We have a recessionary gap. In this case, we're still going to see an upward shift of our planned aggregate expenditures, but in this case, it'll be the right amount so that our new equilibrium output is at the potential output, YP. And we know that this upward shift is coming from the rise in planned investment, again leading to the rise in our equilibrium output from Y1 to YP. This will lead to a rightward shift of our aggregate demand curve because we're seeing more demand in the economy, initially coming from planned investment. And we're at the point where all these three graphs, the aggregate demand, short run, and long run aggregate supplies, are all crossing, which means we're at the long run equilibrium and we're at the potential output. We see a higher aggregate price level at P2. And so we have successfully moved from the short run equilibrium to the long run equilibrium. I am relabeling the points of equilibrium on the Keynesian cross and the liquidity preference model to help you clearly see the connection. So we're going from the short run equilibrium point to the long run equilibrium point as a result of a successful expansionary monetary policy through reducing the discount rate. So as a result, we see a lower nominal interest rate, a higher investment spending, higher consumption, higher real GDP, Y, and a higher aggregate price level as a result of the monetary policy. Now, this is an appropriate policy because we used an expansionary monetary policy when we were experiencing a recessionary gap. We were able to successfully reduce the output gap and get out of the recession as a result of this particular monetary policy. This is how you conduct your stabilization policies. You want to conduct expansionary policies, fiscal or monetary, when you're experiencing recessionary gaps. And if you're experiencing inflationary gaps, then you want to implement contractionary policies, whether fiscal or monetary.